A single gunshot echoed through the dusty main street of Cripple Creek, Colorado, startling Fiona Pierce as she clutched her worn leather satchel tightly against her chest. The year was 1887, and the gold mining town was still thriving despite the harsh conditions of the Rocky Mountains. Fiona, 22 years old with copper hair that caught the late afternoon sun, watched anxiously as the stagecoach driver loaded the last of the passengers' luggage onto the roof of the vehicle. Final boarding for Denver. The driver called out, his voice gruff from years of shouting over the sound of galloping horses. Fiona rushed forward, her simple blue dress billowing around her ankles as she approached. "Sir, please, I need passage to Denver," she said, trying to keep her voice steady despite her desperation. The stagecoach driver, a weathered man with a salt and pepper beard, looked down at her from his perch. "That'll be $8, miss." Fiona's heart sank. She opened her small coin purse and counted the meager amount inside $3.42. It was everything she had in the world. I only have this much," she admitted, holding out the coins. "But I must get to Denver. My aunt is ill and she's the only family I have left." The driver's expression didn't soften. "Can't help you, miss. Rules are rules. $8 or no ride." "Please," she begged, "I can work to pay the difference when we arrive." "Sorry, miss," the driver said, shaking his head. "We've heard that one before." He turned away, signaling to the last of the passengers to hurry aboard. Tears welled in Fiona's eyes as she watched her chance to reach Denver slip away. The stagecoach was the only reliable transportation out of Cripple Creek, and the next one wouldn't come for another week. Her aunt's letter had been urgent. She needed Fiona now. As the driver climbed onto his seat, Fiona made one last desperate plea. "Sir, please, I'll give you my mother's locket. It's silver." She fumbled with the chain around her neck, the only memento she had of her mother who had passed away 3 years prior. The driver hesitated but then shook his head again. "Can't take personal items as payment, company policy. Good day, miss." With a crack of his whip, the stagecoach lurched forward, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. Fiona stood in the middle of the street, watching her hopes disappear along with the coach. "Looks like you're having a rough day, madam." The deep voice came from behind her, and Fiona turned to find herself staring up at a tall man with broad shoulders and sun-weathered skin. He wore a dark Stetson hat that cast a shadow over his eyes, but she could still see their intense green color. His stubbled jaw was set in a firm line, and a leather vest covered his white shirt. Everything about him screamed cowboy. "That's one way to put it," Fiona replied, hastily wiping away her tears with the back of her hand. "Quentin Hayes," he introduced himself, touching the brim of his hat. "Couldn't help but overhear your predicament." "Fiona Pierce," she responded automatically. "And yes, I needed to get to Denver urgently, but—" She gestured helplessly at the disappearing stagecoach. Quentin studied her for a moment, then glanced at the horse hitched to a post outside the saloon, a magnificent chestnut stallion with a white star on its forehead. "You really need to get to Denver. My aunt is ill. She's all the family I have left in this world," Fiona explained, trying to maintain her composure. Quentin's expression softened slightly. "Well, Miss Pierce, I can't in good conscience leave a lady stranded." He nodded toward his horse. "Rusty and I were headed north anyway. I'd be willing to escort you to Denver." Fiona's eyes widened in surprise. "You do that for a stranger? Out here, kindness can be the difference between life and death," he said simply. "Besides, I've got business in Denver myself." Fiona hesitated. Traveling alone with a man she just met wasn't exactly proper, but her options were limited, and there was something in Quentin's straightforward gaze that inspired trust. "I couldn't possibly accept without offering some form of payment," she said, her pride getting the better of her. Quentin shook his head. "Not necessary, but if it makes you feel better, you can buy me a meal when we get to Denver." Fiona felt a small smile tug at her lips for the first time that day. "That's a deal, Mr. Hayes." "Quentin," he corrected. "If we're going to be traveling companions for a couple of days, we might as well use first names." He reached for her satchel. "May I?" She surrendered her bag, and he secured it to his saddle with practiced ease. Then, to her surprise, he removed his coat and offered it to her. "Nights get cold in the mountains," he explained. "We'll need to make camp soon." Fiona took the coat, the leather still warm from his body. "Thank you." Quentin mounted his horse with fluid grace, then extended his hand down to her. "You ever ride before, Miss Pierce?" "Fiona," she reminded him with a small smile. "And yes, though it's been some time." His strong hand closed around hers, and with a swift motion he pulled her up behind him. Fiona settled onto the horse, suddenly aware of how intimate this arrangement was. Her hands hovered awkwardly, unsure where to place them. "You'll want to hold on," Quentin advised, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Rusty here has a spirited stride." Hesitantly, Fiona placed her hands on Quentin's sides, feeling the solid muscle beneath his shirt. "Ready?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder. "As I'll ever be," she replied, trying to ignore the flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with anxiety about the journey. With a click of his tongue and a gentle nudge of his heels, Quentin set the horse in motion. They trotted down the main street of Cripple Creek, drawing curious glances from townsfolk. Fiona kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, aware of the impropriety but too grateful for Quentin's help to care about gossip. As they left the town behind and the vast Colorado landscape opened up before them, Fiona felt a strange mix of trepidation and exhilaration. The sun was beginning its descent behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "It's beautiful," she murmured, almost to herself. "That it is," Quentin agreed. "This country has a way of making a person feel small and significant all at once." "How so?" Fiona asked, curious about this philosophical cowboy. "Small because of the vastness. Look at those mountains, those skies. But significant because surviving out here takes grit. Every person who makes it in this wilderness has earned their place." Fiona considered his words. "I suppose I never thought of it that way." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats and the occasional cry of a hawk the only sounds breaking the tranquility. Fiona found herself gradually relaxing, her grip on Quentin's sides becoming less tentative. "May I ask what awaits you in Denver?" Quentin inquired as they navigated a narrow trail that wound through a grove of aspen trees, their leaves shimmering gold in the fading light. "My Aunt Eliza has fallen ill," Fiona explained. "She raised me after my parents died, first my father in a mining accident when I was 12, then my mother from pneumonia 3 years ago." The familiar ache of loss tightened her chest. "I've been working as a seamstress in Cripple Creek, but when I received her letter last week." Her voice trailed off. "I'm sorry to hear that," Quentin said, his voice genuinely sympathetic. "Family is precious, indeed." Fiona hesitated, then asked, "And what takes you to Denver?" There was a pause before Quentin answered, "Business of a personal nature." His tone made it clear he didn't wish to elaborate, and Fiona respected his privacy. They each had their reasons for this journey, and not all stories needed to be shared with strangers, no matter how kind they might be. As darkness began to fall, Quentin guided Rusty off the main trail toward a small clearing beside a creek. "We'll make camp here for the night," he announced, bringing the horse to a stop. He dismounted with ease, then turned to help Fiona down. His hands circled her waist, and he lifted her as if she weighed nothing more than a feather. For a brief moment, they stood close enough that Fiona could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. A strange tension hung in the air between them before Quentin stepped back, clearing his throat. "I'll get a fire started," he said, turning away. "There's jerky in my saddlebag if you're hungry." Fiona busied herself with retrieving the food while Quentin gathered firewood. She watched surreptitiously as he moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to the wilderness. His every action was purposeful and efficient. Soon, a small fire crackled merrily in the clearing, casting a warm glow over their makeshift camp. Quentin had spread a bedroll on either side of the fire, maintaining a respectful distance. "It's not the Palmer house," he said with a self-deprecating smile, "but it'll keep us warm for the night." Fiona sat cross-legged on her bedroll, Quentin's coat draped over her shoulders. "It's perfect," she assured him. "I've never actually camped beneath the stars before." Quentin raised an eyebrow. "Never," she shook her head. "My father was protective, and after he died, my mother was even more so. Then in Cripple Creek, I rarely ventured beyond the town limits." "Well then," he said, settling on his own bedroll, "you're in for a treat." On clear nights like this, the sky puts on quite a show. As if on cue, Fiona looked up to see a spectacular canopy of stars stretching endlessly above them. Without the lights of town to dim their brilliance, the stars seemed close enough to touch, millions of them scattered across the velvet darkness. "It's breathtaking," she whispered. "It is," Quentin agreed, but when Fiona glanced at him, she found he wasn't looking at the stars at all. His gaze was fixed on her, thoughtful and intense. He quickly looked away when their eyes met. They shared the jerky and some dried fruit Quentin had packed, along with water from the creek that he assured her was clean and fresh. The simple meal tasted better than any fine dining Fiona had experienced, perhaps because of the crisp mountain air or perhaps because of the company. "How long have you been a cowboy?" Fiona asked as they ate. Quentin chuckled. "I'm not exactly a cowboy in the traditional sense. I own a small ranch outside of Boulder, raise horses mostly, but I spent my fair share of time driving cattle in my younger days." "And you're so ancient now," Fiona teased, surprising herself with her boldness. That drew a genuine laugh from him. 32 last spring." "Not ancient, but I've lived enough to know the value of putting down roots." "Your ranch sounds lovely," Fiona said, trying to picture it. "It is," Quentin nodded, a note of pride in his voice. "Nothing fancy, mind you. A simple house, a good barn, and some of the finest grazing land in Colorado. Took me 10 years of saving every penny to buy it." "That's impressive," Fiona said sincerely, "to build something of your own." "What about you?" Quentin asked. "What dreams does Fiona Pierce harbor?" She considered the question, her fingers absently tracing patterns on the leather coat. "I suppose I've never allowed myself to dream too grandly. After my mother died, it was all about survival." She paused. "But if I could choose, I'd like a small shop of my own someday. I'm quite skilled with a needle and thread." "I don't doubt it," Quentin said. "Your dress, did you make it?" Fiona nodded, pleased by his observation. "I did. The craftsmanship shows," he commented. "A keen eye for detail is rare." His compliment warmed her more than the fire. They continued talking as the night deepened. Sharing stories of their lives, Quentin spoke of his years working on various ranches, while Fiona told him about growing up in a mining town, the daughter of a man who sought gold but found only hardship. Eventually, a comfortable lull fell in their conversation. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the night air had grown significantly cooler. "We should get some rest," Quentin said, adding a few more sticks to the fire. "We've got a long ride tomorrow if we want to make good time to Denver." Fiona nodded and lay down on her bedroll, pulling the blanket Quentin had provided up to her chin. Despite the softness of the blanket and her exhaustion, sleep eluded her. The ground was hard beneath her, and every sound of the wilderness, the rustle of leaves, the distant howl of a coyote kept her alert. From across the fire, Quentin's voice came quietly. "Can't sleep. Is it that obvious?" she whispered back. "Your breathing gives you away," he said. "It's different when you're asleep." "I didn't realize you were studying my breathing patterns, Mr. Hayes," Fiona replied, a smile in her voice. She heard him chuckle. "Just an observation. Try closing your eyes and listening to the creek. The sound of water has a way of soothing restless thoughts." Fiona followed his advice, focusing on the gentle gurgle of the creek nearby. Gradually, her eyelids grew heavy, and the last thing she remembered before drifting off was the silhouette of Quentin against the starlit sky, keeping watch over their small camp. Morning arrived with a chorus of birdsong and the fresh scent of dew-covered grass. Fiona awoke to find Quentin already up, tending to a small fire where a pot of coffee was beginning to boil. He had removed his hat, and she noticed for the first time that his dark brown hair had a slight wave to it. "Good morning," he greeted her, offering a tin cup of steaming coffee. "Sleep well, better than I expected," Fiona admitted, accepting the cup gratefully. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it chased away the last vestiges of sleep. "Thank you." They broke their fast with more dried fruit and some hardtack Quentin produced from his saddlebag. As they ate, he outlined their route for the day. "If we make good time, we can reach the town of Fairplay by nightfall," he explained. "There's a decent inn there where you can have a proper bed." "That sounds wonderful," Fiona said, though a part of her had enjoyed their night beneath the stars more than she cared to admit. They packed up camp efficiently, Quentin showing Fiona how to properly roll the bedding and secure it to the saddle. His hands occasionally brushed against hers during the process, sending an unexpected tingle up her arm each time. Soon they were on the trail again, Fiona once more seated behind Quentin on Rusty's broad back. The morning air was crisp and invigorating, and the landscape that unfurled before them was nothing short of spectacular. They traversed meadows carpeted with wildflowers, forded shallow streams where Rusty paused to drink, and wound their way through forests of pine that filled the air with a fresh, resinous scent. As they rode, Quentin pointed out various landmarks and shared stories of the land tales of the Native American tribes who had once called these mountains home, of the first trappers and explorers who had mapped the wilderness, and of the miners and settlers who had come seeking fortune and freedom. "My grandfather was one of the first to settle in this part of Colorado," he told her. "Came out in '59 during the Pikes Peak gold rush. Never found much gold, but he found something better land where he could be his own man." "Is that where your ranch is now, land your grandfather claimed?" Fiona asked, genuinely interested. Quentin shook his head. "No, he lost it all in a card game before I was born. Typical of the Hayes men, big dreams, bigger mistakes. I was determined to do better." There was something in his tone, a mixture of determination and old pain that made Fiona want to know more about him, but she held her questions. They had known each other less than a day after all. Around midday, they stopped in a sheltered grove to rest Rusty and eat a simple lunch of jerky and the last of the dried fruit. Fiona stretched her legs, which were becoming sore from the unaccustomed hours in the saddle. "How are you holding up?" Quentin asked, noticing her wince as she walked. "I'm fine," she assured him, not wanting to appear weak. "Just a bit stiff." Quentin nodded knowingly. "It'll get worse before it gets better, I'm afraid. The body needs time to adjust to long rides." "I'll manage," Fiona said, lifting her chin determinedly. "After all, I've already imposed on your kindness enough without complaining about a little discomfort." Quentin's expression softened. "You're not imposing, Fiona. I offered my help freely." "Why?" The question escaped her before she could stop it. "Why would you go so far out of your way for a stranger?" Quentin was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant peaks. "Maybe I'm not as altruistic as I seem. Maybe I was just heading to Denver anyway." "But you weren't," Fiona said with certainty. "You said you were headed north, but Denver is east of Cripple Creek." A small smile played at the corner of his mouth. "You were paying attention." "I always pay attention, Mr. Hayes." "Quentin," he corrected again, then sighed. "The truth is, I've been in your position before, stranded without help. Someone showed me kindness when I needed it most. I'm just passing it along." His answer was simple but spoke volumes about his character. Fiona felt a newfound respect for this quiet, thoughtful man who had come to her rescue. As they prepared to continue their journey, Quentin surprised her by offering some advice. "Shift your weight more when we ride. It'll help with the soreness. And don't be afraid to hold on tighter. Rusty won't mind the extra weight, and it'll give you more stability." Fiona nodded, and when they mounted up again, she followed his suggestion, gripping his sides more firmly. The increased contact made her acutely aware of the strength in his torso, the way his muscles moved with each breath. They rode through the afternoon, climbing steadily higher into the mountains. The air grew cooler and the views more spectacular. At one point, They emerged from a dense forest to find themselves on a ridge overlooking a vast valley, where a river wound like a silver ribbon through the landscape below. South Park, Quentin informed her. One of the largest high mountain valleys in the world. It's magnificent, Fiona breathed, taking in the panoramic vista. This is why I could never leave Colorado, Quentin said, his voice filled with quiet passion. No matter how many times I see views like this, they never fail to humble me. As they began their descent into the valley, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. Quentin eyed them with concern. Looks like we might catch some weather, he observed. Mountain storms can be fierce and unpredictable. Should we seek shelter? Fiona asked, noting the rapidly darkening sky. Quentin nodded. There's an old line shack about a mile ahead used by cowboys during cattle drives. If we're lucky, it'll still be standing. They urged Rusty to a faster pace, the horse seeming to sense the urgency as he picked his way down the rocky trail. The first fat droplets of rain began to fall just as a small wooden structure came into view, nestled against a hillside and partially obscured by pine trees. There it is, Quentin said with relief. They reached the lined shack just as the skies opened up in earnest, rain falling in sheets. Quentin quickly dismounted and helped Fiona down, then led Rusty to a lean-to attached to the side of the cabin. Get inside, he told Fiona, handing her the saddlebags. I'll make sure Rusty is settled. Fiona pushed open the creaking door of the shack and stepped into the dim interior. It was a simple one-room structure with a dirt floor, a small stone fireplace and rough-hewn furniture, a table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed frame with a straw-filled mattress. The roof appeared mostly intact, though a few drips found their way through in the corners. Quentin joined her moments later, water streaming from his hat and coat. Not exactly the Fairplay Inn, he said apologetically, removing his hat and shaking off the excess water. It's shelter from the storm, Fiona replied pragmatically. We're fortunate to have found it. Quentin set about making the shack as comfortable as possible. He found some dry firewood stacked beside the fireplace and soon had a small blaze going, filling the space with warmth and light. From his saddlebag, he produced a lantern which he lit and placed on the table. We'll have to wait out the storm, he said, peering through the single window at the tempest outside. Could be an hour, could be all night. Fiona tried to hide her dismay. Sharing a campsite beneath the open sky was one thing, being confined to a tiny cabin was quite another. Not that she feared Quentin, he had proven himself nothing but honorable, but the situation pushed the boundaries of propriety to their limit. Reading her expression, Quentin quickly added, I'll sleep on the floor, of course, you take the bed. I couldn't possibly, Fiona began. I insist, he cut her off gently. I've slept on worse, believe me. Outside, lightning flashed, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. Fiona jumped and Quentin gave her a reassuring smile. Just the mountains talking, he said. Old-timers say it's the spirits of the Ute having a council meeting. Fiona managed a small smile in return. My father used to say thunderstorms were God's way of reminding us who's really in charge. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was, Fiona said softly. Though not always wise with his money or his dreams. He chased gold his whole life but never found enough to make a difference. Quentin rummaged in his saddlebag again and produced a small package wrapped in waxed paper. Not much for dinner, I'm afraid. Just some pemmican and the last of the hardtack. It's more than enough, Fiona assured him, accepting her portion gratefully. They sat at the rough table, the storm raging outside while they ate their simple meal. The close quarters seemed to encourage confidences, and Fiona found herself sharing more of her story, how her father's death had left her mother struggling to make ends meet, how she had learned sewing from a neighbor to help bring in extra money, and how, after her mother's death, she had continued the trade in Cripple Creek. It's not the life I imagined as a girl, she admitted, but I've managed to survive. Surviving is no small feat in this world, Quentin said, his voice low and earnest, but you deserve more than just survival, Fiona. The way he said her name sent a flutter through her chest. "And what about you?" she asked, deflecting attention from herself. "You mentioned you had business in Denver, but you've been vague about what that entails." Quentin was quiet for so long that Fiona thought he might not answer. Finally, he sighed and met her gaze directly. "I'm going to confront the man who killed my brother," he said, his voice even despite the weight of his words. Fiona's breath caught in her throat. "Killed your brother?" Quentin nodded, his expression grim. 2 years ago. Sam was my younger brother, hot-headed, impulsive, but with a heart of gold. He got into a card game with a man named Lee Thornton in Denver. Accused Thornton of cheating, which he probably was. Words were exchanged, then bullets. He paused, his jaw tightening. Sam never stood a chance. He wasn't wearing a gun, but Thornton shot him anyway, claimed self-defense. The authorities believed him or were paid to believe him. "I'm so sorry," Fiona said softly, instinctively reaching across the table to place her hand on his. Quentin looked down at their hands, then back up at her face. "I've been tracking Thornton ever since. He's a slippery one, always moving from town to town. But I got word last week that he's back in Denver dealing cards at a place called the Silver Spur. And you plan to." "What?" Fiona asked, suddenly afraid of his answer. "Get justice," Quentin said simply. "Legal justice if possible. I've gathered witnesses who saw what really happened, people willing to testify now that they're not under Thornton's immediate threat. I'm meeting with a federal marshal in Denver the day after tomorrow." Relief flooded through Fiona. "So you're not planning to kill him?" Quentin finished her thought. "No, though I won't lie and say the thought hasn't crossed my mind, but that's not who I am. Sam wouldn't want me to throw my life away seeking revenge." Fiona squeezed his hand gently. "Your brother would be proud of your restraint." "Maybe," Quentin said, his voice rough with emotion. "I just know I have to see this through one way or another." The intensity in his eyes stirred something deep within Fiona, a recognition of the depth of his character, the strength of his convictions. In that moment, she realized that Quentin Hayes was unlike any man she had ever known. They sat in silence for a while, the crackle of the fire and the drumming of rain on the roof the only sounds. Quentin's hand remained beneath hers, neither withdrawing nor advancing, a simple point of connection between them. Eventually, the exhaustion of the day's ride caught up with Fiona, and she found herself stifling a yawn. "You should rest," Quentin said, gently withdrawing his hand. "We'll see what the weather brings in the morning." He insisted she take his bedroll as well as her own for additional comfort on the narrow bed. Once she was settled, he spread his coat on the floor near the fire and stretched out, using his saddle as a pillow. "Good night, Fiona," he said, tipping his hat over his eyes. "Good night, Quentin," she replied, watching the firelight play across his features before closing her own eyes. Despite her physical fatigue, Fiona's mind was alive with thoughts of the man lying just a few feet away, his kindness, his honor, his quiet strength. She had known him barely a day, yet she felt as if she'd glimpsed his soul. It was a dangerous feeling, she knew, to form attachments so quickly, especially to a man with such a perilous mission ahead. Yet as sleep finally claimed her, her last thoughts were of green eyes that seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed defenses. Morning brought clear skies and renewed hope. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a washed, clean world sparkling with droplets of water on every surface. Fiona awoke to find Quentin already outside, tending to Rusty and preparing for their departure. "The trail will be muddy," he warned as they shared a quick breakfast of the last of their provisions. "But if we're careful, we should make good time. Denver is still a day's ride away, but we might be able to reach a town called Bailey by nightfall. It's small, but they have a decent boarding house." Fiona nodded, secretly relieved that they wouldn't have to spend another night alone together. Not because she feared Quentin, quite the opposite. She was beginning to fear her own growing feelings for him. They set off as the sun rose higher, the muddy trail making for slower going than Quentin had hoped. Rusty picked his way carefully around the worst of the mire, but they still had to dismount several times to lead him through particularly treacherous stretches. By midday, they had made less progress than anticipated. They stopped for a brief rest in a sunny clearing, both of them mud-spattered and weary. "I'm sorry about the delay," Quentin said, genuine concern in his eyes. "I know you're anxious to reach your aunt." "It's not your fault," Fiona assured him. "You've already done more than I could have asked. Without you, I'd still be standing in Cripple Creek watching the stagecoach disappear." He studied her face for a moment, then said quietly, "I'm glad I was there." The simple statement hung in the air between them, laden with meaning neither was ready to acknowledge. They continued their journey, the terrain gradually becoming less steep as they approached the eastern slopes of the mountains. The forests thinned, revealing sweeping vistas of the plains beyond. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks behind them, Quentin pointed to a thin column of smoke in the distance. "Bailey," he said, "we'll make it there before nightfall after all." Fiona felt a curious mixture of relief and disappointment. The closer they got to Denver, the sooner their journey and their time together would end. The small town of Bailey welcomed them as dusk was falling. It was little more than a cluster of buildings along a single dirt street, but after their adventures in the wilderness, it seemed the height of civilization. Quentin guided Rusty to a modest stable attached to the town's only boarding house. "Wait here," he said, helping Fiona dismount. "I'll see about rooms." He returned a few minutes later with a slightly uncomfortable expression. "There's a bit of a situation," he began. "The boarding house only has one room available." Fiona's eyes widened. "One room," Quentin nodded. "There's a group of surveyors passing through, taking up most of the space. The owner offered us the last room, but—" He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. "But it wouldn't be proper," Fiona finished for him. "No, it wouldn't," he agreed. "I'll sleep in the stable with Rusty, you take the room." "Quentin, I can't let you, it's not open for debate," he said firmly. "You need proper rest before we reach Denver tomorrow. Besides, I've slept in plenty of stables. They're warmer than you might think." His tone made it clear the matter was settled, and Fiona didn't have the energy to argue further. Truth be told, the prospect of a real bed and perhaps even a bath was too tempting to resist. The boarding house was simple but clean, and the elderly woman who owned it took one look at Fiona's travel-worn appearance and immediately offered a hot bath for an additional 25 cents. Fiona hesitated, counting her meager remaining funds, but Quentin quietly pressed 2 coins into the woman's hand. "Add a hot meal to that as well," he said. "I'll be back in an hour to escort Miss Pierce to dinner." Before Fiona could protest, he was gone, leading Rusty toward the stable. The boarding house owner gave Fiona a knowing look. "That's a good man you've got there, dearie," she commented as she led Fiona to her room. "Not many would sleep in a stable while their lady takes the comfortable bed." "He's not Fiona began, then stopped. How could she explain their unusual arrangement? "Yes, he is a good man," she said simply. The bath was heavenly, the first real washing Fiona had enjoyed since leaving Cripple Creek. She scrubbed away the dust and mud of the trail, washing her hair with the lavender-scented soap the owner provided. Her blue dress was beyond salvaging without a proper laundering, so she donned her one other outfit, a simple brown skirt and white blouse she had packed in her satchel. Precisely an hour after he had left, there was a knock at her door. Fiona opened it to find Quentin standing there, his hat in his hands. He had clearly made use of the stable's pump to clean up, his face freshly washed and his hair still damp. He had changed into a clean shirt as well, and Fiona couldn't help but notice how the crisp white fabric contrasted with his tanned skin. "You look," he began, then seemed at a loss for words. "Less like I've been dragged behind a horse for 2 days, Fiona suggested with a small smile. That drew a chuckle from him. "I was going to say lovely, but yes, that too." The compliment brought a flush to Fiona's cheeks. "Thank you for everything, including the bath. I insist on repaying you once we reach Denver." "We'll discuss that later," Quentin said, offering his arm. "For now, dinner awaits, And I don't know about you, but I'm famished. The boarding house dining room was simple but homey, with checkered tablecloths and a crackling fire in the hearth. They were seated at a small table in the corner, away from the boisterous group of surveyors who dominated the center of the room. The meal was hearty frontier fare venison stew, fresh baked bread, and apple pie for dessert. After days of jerky and hardtack, it tasted like the finest cuisine either of them had ever experienced. They ate with gusto, exchanging smiles across the table as they savored each bite. As they lingered over cups of coffee, Fiona found herself studying Quentin's face in the warm glow of the lantern light. The rugged planes of his cheeks, the tiny scar above his left eyebrow, the way the corners of his eyes crinkled when he smiled, she committed each detail to memory, aware that their time together was drawing to a close. "What will you do after Denver?" she asked suddenly. "After you've confronted this man, Thornton?" Quentin considered the question, turning his coffee cup slowly between his hands. "Go home to my ranch, I suppose. There are fences that need mending, horses that need training." He paused, then added softly, "An empty house that needs filling." Their eyes met across the table, and in that moment, Fiona felt as if they were the only two people in the room, perhaps in the world. The intensity of his gaze made her breath catch, and she found herself wondering what it would be like to be the one to fill that emptiness he spoke of. The spell was broken by the owner arriving to clear their plates. "More coffee," she offered. "No, thank you," Quentin declined. "We have an early start tomorrow." They walked together to Fiona's room, stopping outside her door. An awkward silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken words. "Quentin, Fiona began, just as he said. Fiona, they both stopped, then laughed softly. "Ladies first," Quentin said with a gentlemanly nod. Fiona took a deep breath. "I just wanted to thank you again, not just for the ride to Denver, but for everything. Your kindness, your company." "It's been my pleasure," Quentin replied, his voice low and sincere. "Truly." He reached out slowly, as if giving her time to pull away, and tucked a stray strand of copper hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered for just a moment against her cheek, a touch so light it might have been imagined. "Good night, Fiona," he said, dropping his hand. "Sleep well." "Good night," she whispered as he turned to go, her skin still tingling where his fingers had been. Inside her room, Fiona sat on the edge of the bed, her heart racing. What was happening to her? She had known Quentin Hayes for barely 2 days, yet he had somehow worked his way past all her careful defenses. It was madness to feel this way about a man she had just met, a man who would ride out of her life as quickly as he had ridden in. Yet as she lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the boarding house settling for the night, she couldn't stop her thoughts from wandering to the cowboy sleeping in the stable, and what might have been under different circumstances. Morning arrived all too quickly, bringing with it the final leg of their journey to Denver. Fiona met Quentin at the stable, where he already had Rusty saddled and ready. They ate a quick breakfast provided by the boarding house, then set off just as the sun was beginning to illuminate the eastern horizon. "We should reach Denver by early afternoon," Quentin informed her as they rode out of Bailey. "The trail is mostly downhill from here, following the river into the city." Fiona nodded, trying to focus on the prospect of seeing her aunt rather than the impending separation from Quentin. "That's good news. I'm anxious to see how Aunt Eliza is faring." They rode in companionable silence for much of the morning, the landscape gradually transforming from the foothills of the Rockies to the rolling grasslands that surrounded Denver. The city itself came into view shortly after midday, a sprawling settlement of wooden and brick buildings nestled against the backdrop of the mountains. "There it is," Quentin said, reining Rusty to a halt on a rise overlooking the city. "Denver." Fiona took in the sight, the smoke rising from countless chimneys, the glint of sunlight on the South Platte River that snaked through the center of town, the bustling activity even visible from this distance. It was by far the largest city she had ever seen. "It's impressive," she said. And a bit overwhelming if you're not used to cities, Quentin added, glancing at her. Do you know where your aunt lives? Fiona nodded, reaching into her pocket to retrieve the letter her aunt had sent. She gave me the address 23 Larimer Street near the downtown area. I know Larimer, Quentin said with a nod. I'll take you right to her door. They continued their journey, entering the outskirts of Denver where modest homes gave way to increasingly dense development. The streets were busy with wagons, horses, and pedestrians going about their business. Fiona found herself instinctively moving closer to Quentin as they navigated through the bustle. Larimer Street proved to be one of the main thoroughfares, lined with shops, offices, and a mix of residences. Quentin counted the numbers until they reached a neat two-story house painted a pale yellow with white trim. A small garden in the front yard was carefully tended, with late summer flowers still in bloom. This is it, Quentin said, bringing Rusty to a stop in front of the house. He dismounted, then helped Fiona down. For a moment they stood close together, his hands still at her waist, neither making a move to step away. I suppose this is goodbye, Fiona said, trying to keep her voice steady. Quentin's expression was unreadable. I suppose it is. He released her and retrieved her satchel from the saddle, handing it to her with formal politeness. I wish you and your aunt well, Miss Pierce. The return to her surname wasn't lost on Fiona. He was already distancing himself, preparing for their parting, and I wish you success with your business, she replied, unable to directly mention his confrontation with Thornton. Quentin nodded, understanding her meaning. Thank you. An awkward silence fell between them, filled with words unsaid. Finally, Quentin cleared his throat. I should be going. The marshal will be expecting me. Yes, of course, Fiona said quickly. Thank you again for everything, Mr. Hayes. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that had become familiar over their short acquaintance. It was my honor, Miss Pierce. With that, he mounted Rusty and with one last look at Fiona standing before her aunt's gate, turned and rode back the way they had come, soon disappearing around a corner. Fiona stood watching the empty street for several moments, a curious emptiness settling in her chest. Then, squaring her shoulders, she turned and walked up the path to her aunt's front door. The woman who answered her knock was not her Aunt Eliza but a middle-aged lady with a kind face and capable hands. Can I help you? She inquired. I'm Fiona Pierce, Eliza Pierce's niece, Fiona explained. I received a letter saying she was ill. The woman's expression softened with recognition. Of course, Miss Pierce. I'm Mrs. Caldwell, the nurse your aunt hired. Please come in. Your aunt has been asking for you. Fiona stepped into the tidy entryway following Mrs. Caldwell up a flight of stairs to a bedroom at the back of the house. The room was bright and airy, with windows open to catch the afternoon breeze. In the center stood a large four-poster bed where a frail figure rested against a mountain of pillows. Eliza, your niece has arrived, Mrs. Caldwell announced. The woman in the bed turned her head, her face lighting up with a smile despite her obvious weakness. Fiona, oh, my dear girl, you came. Fiona rushed to her aunt's bedside, taking the older woman's thin hand in hers. Of course I came. Your letter sounded so urgent. Aunt Eliza nodded, her expression growing serious. It was urgent, my dear. The doctor says I have consumption. He's not optimistic about my chances. Fiona felt tears spring to her eyes. Oh, Aunt Eliza, no. Her aunt squeezed her hand. Now, none of that. I've lived a good, long life. But there are matters we must discuss while I'm still able. That's why I sent for you. Over the next hour, Aunt Eliza explained that she had made provisions for Fiona in her will. The house on Larimer Street, a modest savings account at the Denver National Bank, and her late husband's business, a small but respected dress shop downtown, would all pass to Fiona upon her death. Uncle James always said the shop needed a young woman's touch, Aunt Eliza explained. Mrs. Winters has been managing it since his passing, but she's ready to retire. With your sewing skills, you could make it thrive again. Fiona sat in stunned silence, trying to process this unexpected turn of events. A home, a business, the very thing she had dreamed of but never expected to achieve. Aunt Eliza, I don't know what to say, she finally managed. Say you'll stay, her aunt replied simply. Stay and care for me in my final days, then take up the life, James, and I always hoped to provide for you. We never had children of our own, you know. You're the daughter we never had. Tears spilled down Fiona's cheeks as she leaned forward to embrace her aunt carefully. Of course I'll stay, she whispered, for as long as you need me. The next few days passed in a blur as Fiona settled into her new role as her aunt's caretaker. Mrs. Caldwell stayed on, showing Fiona how to administer Eliza's medicines and make her comfortable. Between these duties, Fiona found time to visit her uncle's dress shop now, apparently her dress shop where she met the kindly Mrs. Winters, who was all too happy to show her the ropes of running the business. Through it all, Fiona found her thoughts continually straying to Quentin. Had he found Thornton? Had the marshal agreed to help? Was he safe? She wished she had some way to contact him, to know if he had achieved the justice he sought. On her third evening in Denver, as she sat beside Aunt Eliza's bed reading aloud from one of her favorite novels, there was a knock at the front door downstairs. Mrs. Caldwell had gone home for the evening, so Fiona marked her place in the book and went to answer. She opened the door to find Quentin Hayes standing on the porch, hat in hand, looking as if he wasn't entirely sure of his welcome. Quentin, she breathed, unable to hide her delight at seeing him again. Fiona, he replied, a smile breaking across his features. I hope I'm not intruding. Not at all, she assured him, stepping back to invite him in. Please come inside. How did you find me? I remembered the address, he said simply, stepping into the entryway and looking around with appreciation at the comfortable home. How is your aunt? Fiona's smile faded slightly. Not well, I'm afraid. The doctor has confirmed she has consumption. But she's comfortable, and having me here seems to lift her spirits. Quentin nodded solemnly. I'm sorry to hear that. Consumption is a cruel disease. Yes, Fiona agreed. But what of your business? Were you successful in meeting with the marshal? A slow smile spread across Quentin's face. I was. Better than successful, in fact. The marshal had been building a case against Thornton for some time, not just for Sam's death, but for a string of similar incidents across Colorado and Wyoming. My witnesses were the final piece he needed. Thornton was arrested yesterday. Oh, Quentin, that's wonderful news, Fiona exclaimed, genuinely happy for him. Your brother can rest in peace now. I believe he can, Quentin agreed, his expression lightening as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The marshal says Thornton will likely hang for his crimes, or at the very least spend the rest of his life in prison. There was a moment of silence between them, filled with the unspoken question of why he had come back to see her. Quentin began, then cleared his throat. I wanted to make sure you were settled before I headed back to my ranch. That's very thoughtful of you, Fiona said softly. Quentin shifted his hat in his hands, suddenly looking uncharacteristically nervous. Actually, there's another reason I came. I was wondering if you might. That is, if you'd be amenable to correspondence. Correspondence? Fiona repeated, not quite understanding. Letters, Quentin clarified. I thought perhaps we could write to each other. It's just that our journey together, brief as it was, left quite an impression on me, and I'd hate for us to lose touch entirely. The simple, honest admission touched Fiona deeply. I'd like that very much, she said, a smile blossoming on her face. In fact, I was just thinking of you, wondering how your meeting with the marshal had gone. Relief washed over Quentin's features. Good, that's good. Another silence fell, this one more comfortable than the last. Would you like to come up and meet my aunt? Fiona offered suddenly. She's still awake, and I know she'd love to meet the man who helped me reach her side. Quentin hesitated. I wouldn't want to tire her. Just a brief visit, Fiona assured him. She'd be disappointed if she knew you were here and didn't say hello. He nodded his agreement, and Fiona led him upstairs to Aunt Eliza's room. The older woman was indeed still awake, her bright eyes curious as Fiona entered with a visitor. Aunt Eliza, this is Mr. Quentin Hayes, Fiona introduced. He's the one who helped me reach Denver when the stagecoach left without me. Aunt Eliza's gaze sharpened with interest. The cowboy who offered his horse. Fiona has told me about you, young man. Come closer so I can see you properly. Quentin approached the bed, removing his hat respectfully. Madam, he greeted her, it's a pleasure to meet you. Eliza studied him for a long moment, then nodded as if confirming something to herself. You have honest eyes, Mr. Hayes. That's a rare quality these days. Thank you, madam, Quentin replied, clearly touched by the simple observation. Fiona tells me you own a ranch near Boulder. Yes, madam, nothing grand, but it's mine, free and clear. Eliza nodded again. Good, good. A man should have something of his own. She glanced at Fiona, then back at Quentin. Have you seen my brother James's dress shop yet? It's Fiona's now, you know. No, madam, I haven't had the pleasure, Quentin answered, looking questioningly at Fiona. It's a recent development, Fiona explained. Aunt Eliza has made me her heir. The shop, this house, they'll be mine someday. That's wonderful news, Quentin said sincerely. You mentioned wanting your own shop someday. Now you'll have one. The fact that he remembered her dream, mentioned so briefly during their journey, warmed Fiona's heart. Yes, though I would trade it all to have Aunt Eliza well again, she said softly. Nonsense, Eliza chided. We all have our time, my dear. Mine is drawing to a close, but yours is just beginning. She turned her attention back to Quentin. Mr. Hayes, would you be so kind as to escort my niece to dinner tomorrow evening? She's been cooped up in this sick room for days, and a young woman needs fresh air and good company. Fiona flushed with embarrassment. Aunt Eliza, I'm sure Mr. Hayes has other obligations. Actually, Quentin interrupted, a smile tugging at his lips. I'd be honored to escort Miss Pierce to dinner if she's willing. All eyes turned to Fiona, who felt her cheeks grow even warmer. Yes, that would be lovely, she managed. Excellent, Aunt Eliza declared, satisfaction evident in her voice. Now, if you two will excuse me, I find myself suddenly quite tired. Recognizing the dismissal for what it was, Fiona and Quentin said their goodnights and left Aunt Eliza to rest. As they descended the stairs, Fiona couldn't help but smile at her aunt's transparent matchmaking. I apologize for my aunt's forwardness, she said as they reached the front door. Quentin shook his head, amusement dancing in his eyes. No apology necessary. I admire her directness. And I meant what I said. I would be honored to take you to dinner. Then I accept, Fiona said, meeting his gaze. I'll call for you at 6 tomorrow evening, Quentin said. If that suits. Perfectly, Fiona agreed. Quentin hesitated at the door, as if wanting to say more but uncertain how to proceed. Finally, he simply nodded, placed his hat back on his head and stepped out into the night. Until tomorrow, Fiona, he said, her name a caress on his lips. Until tomorrow, she echoed, watching him walk down the path toward the street, her heart lighter than it had been in days. The following evening, precisely at 6 o'clock, Quentin arrived at the Pierce home dressed in what was clearly his finest suit, a dark blue affair with a crisp white shirt and string tie. His boots were polished to a shine, and his hair was neatly combed beneath his Stetson. Fiona had spent hours preparing for the evening, trying on various dresses from her aunt's closet, before settling on a deep green gown that complemented her copper hair and fair complexion. Mrs. Caldwell had helped her style her hair in an elegant updo, commenting all the while on the handsome cowboy who had come calling. When Fiona descended the stairs to meet Quentin, the look of admiration in his eyes made all the preparation worthwhile. You look beautiful, he said simply, his voice husky. Thank you, Fiona replied, equally affected by his appearance. You clean up rather well yourself, Mr. Hayes. He offered her his arm and she took it, feeling the solid strength beneath the fabric of his suit. A carriage waited outside, a luxury Fiona had not expected. I thought Rusty might deserve a night off, Quentin explained with a smile as he helped her into the vehicle. He had reserved a table at one of Denver's finest restaurants, a French establishment called Le Chalet that catered to the city's elite. Fiona felt slightly out of place among the wealthy patrons, but Quentin's steady presence beside her gave her confidence. They dined on dishes she had never even heard of, let alone tasted coq au vin, escargot, crème brûlée, all accompanied by a fine wine that Quentin selected with surprising knowledge. As they ate, they talked about everything and nothing: her plans for the dress shop, his hopes for expanding his ranch, books they had read, places they hoped to see someday. The easy conversation of their journey continued, but now there was an undercurrent of something more, a tension that was at once exciting and terrifying. After dinner, Quentin suggested a walk through nearby Civic Center Park, where the cool evening air was a welcome relief after the warmth of the restaurant. Gas lamps illuminated the paths, casting a romantic glow over the carefully landscaped gardens. "I feel I should thank your aunt for her interference," Quentin commented as they strolled side by side, his hand occasionally brushing against hers. "Without her suggestion, I might not have found the courage to ask you to dinner." Fiona glanced at him in surprise. "You, lacking courage." "I find that hard to believe," he chuckled. "Facing down a gunslinger is one thing, asking a beautiful woman to dinner is quite another." "Well, I'm glad you found the courage," Fiona said softly. "I've enjoyed this evening immensely." They paused beside a small fountain, the gentle splash of water creating a private space in the public park. Quentin turned to face her, his expression serious in the lamplight. "Fiona, there's something I need to tell you," he began. Her heart skipped a beat. "Yes." "I'm leaving for my ranch tomorrow," he said. "Now that Thornton has been dealt with, I need to get back. There's work waiting, animals that need tending." "Oh." The single syllable couldn't begin to express the disappointment that washed over her. "But before I go, I wanted to be clear about my intentions," Quentin continued. "These past few days meeting you, our journey together, even this evening, they've meant more to me than I can properly express. I know it's sudden, perhaps even foolish, but I find myself—" He paused, searching for the right words. "I find myself thinking about you in ways that go beyond mere friendship." Fiona's breath caught in her throat. "I've been thinking about you too," she admitted. "More than I probably should." Relief flooded Quentin's features. "Then I'm not alone in these feelings." "No," Fiona confirmed. "You're not alone." He took her hands in his touch warm and steady. "I meant what I said about writing to each other. I'd like us to get to know one another better properly, and perhaps when your aunt—" He stopped, realizing the indelicacy of mentioning her aunt's inevitable passing. "When I'm free to leave Denver," Fiona supplied gently. "Yes," Quentin nodded. "Perhaps then you might consider visiting my ranch, see if the life there might suit you." The implication of his words hung in the air between them, not a proposal, not yet, but the possibility of one someday. It was both thrilling and terrifying. "I would like that," Fiona said, her voice barely above a whisper. Quentin's gaze dropped to her lips, and for a moment, Fiona thought he might kiss her. Instead, he lifted one of her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Then we have a plan," he said softly. The carriage ride back to Aunt Eliza's house was quiet, both of them lost in thoughts of what had been said and what remained unspoken. When they arrived, Quentin helped her down and walked her to the door. "I'll write as soon as I reach the ranch," he promised. "I'll be waiting," Fiona replied. This time he did lean in, but only to place a chaste kiss on her cheek. The brief contact sent a shiver through her all the same. "Goodbye, Fiona," he said, stepping back. For now," she echoed, watching as he returned to the carriage and disappeared into the night. The weeks that followed were a strange mixture of sorrow and hope for Fiona. Aunt Eliza's condition deteriorated rapidly, but she faced her decline with remarkable grace, spending her final days ensuring that Fiona was prepared to take over both the house and the business. True to his word, Quentin wrote faithfully. His letters arrived every week, filled with tales of ranch life, updates on Rusty and the other horses, and, increasingly, expressions of his growing feelings for Fiona. She treasured each letter, reading and rereading them until the paper grew thin at the creases, and replied with equal enthusiasm, sharing stories of her days at the dress shop and her evenings at her aunt's bedside. In October, as the first snow dusted the peaks of the distant Rockies, Aunt Eliza passed peacefully in her sleep, her hand held tightly in Fiona's. The funeral was small but dignified, attended by a number of Denver's prominent citizens who had known and respected Eliza and her late husband. Quentin arrived the day before the service, having ridden hard from his ranch as soon as he received Fiona's telegram. His solid presence beside her at the cemetery was the only thing that kept her from collapsing under the weight of her grief. "She loved you very much," he said softly as they stood before the fresh grave. "And she was proud of you. She told me so that night we met." Fiona leaned against him, drawing strength from his warmth. "I'll miss her terribly." "I know," he murmured, his arm around her shoulders. "But you won't face it alone." In the days after the funeral, Fiona threw herself into running the dress shop, finding solace in the familiar rhythm of needle and thread. Quentin remained in Denver, staying at a nearby hotel but spending most of his waking hours with Fiona. They took their meals together, walked in the park, and in the evenings sat by the fire in Aunt Eliza's, now Fiona's, parlor, talking long into the night. A week after the funeral, as they sat together on the sofa, Quentin took Fiona's hand in his. "I need to return to the ranch soon," he said, his voice regretful. "The foreman I hired is capable, but there are decisions that need my attention." Fiona nodded, having expected this. "Of course, you've already stayed longer than you planned." "I've been thinking," Quentin continued, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "About us, about the future." Fiona's heart began to beat faster. "Oh, I know we haven't known each other long, barely 2 months since that day in Cripple Creek. And I know proper courtship usually takes much longer." He paused, his green eyes searching hers. "But I also know how I feel about you, Fiona. I've never been more certain of anything in my life." He slid from the sofa onto one knee before her, still holding her hand. From his pocket, he produced a simple gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond. "Fiona Pierce, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Would you come back to the ranch with me, help me build a home, a family? I promise to cherish you, protect you, and love you for all the days of my life." Tears welled in Fiona's eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Quentin, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to sit beside her again, gathering her into his arms. Their first real kiss was everything Fiona had dreamed it would be, tender yet passionate, a promise of the life they would share. When they finally parted, both breathless, Quentin rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Fiona Pierce, soon to be Hayes." "And I love you, Quentin Hayes," she replied, the words feeling both new and as familiar as if she'd been saying them her whole life. They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at Denver's Trinity Church. Mrs. Winters from the dress shop gave Fiona away, and Quentin's ranch foreman, a gruff but kind man named Charlie, stood as his best man. Fiona wore a gown of her own design, created in the evenings after the shop closed, ivory silk with delicate lace detailing that had all the ladies in attendance sighing with appreciation. After a brief honeymoon at one of Denver's finest hotels, they prepared for the journey to Quentin's ranch. The dress shop was left in the capable hands of Mrs. Winters, who agreed to run it until Fiona could either return to manage it herself or find a buyer. The house on Larimer Street was closed up but not sold. Fiona wasn't ready to part with it just yet. The journey to the ranch was far more comfortable than their first adventure together had been. They traveled by train to Boulder, then by hired carriage for the final leg. As they crested a hill, Quentin pointed ahead to a valley where a modest but well-built house stood surrounded by several outbuildings and corrals. "Welcome home, Mrs. Hayes," he said, squeezing her hand. Fiona took in the sight the house with smoke curling from its chimney, the barn painted a cheerful red, the horses grazing in the pasture, and beyond it all, the majestic backdrop of the Rocky Mountains. It was more beautiful than she had imagined. "It's perfect," she said, leaning against her husband's shoulder. Their arrival at the ranch was met with a warm welcome from the small staff, Charlie the foreman, a cook named Mrs. Abernathy, and two young ranch hands who looked at Fiona with undisguised curiosity. Rusty whinnied a greeting from his corral, seeming to recognize her. "He remembers you," Quentin said with a smile as Fiona approached the fence to stroke the chestnut's velvety nose. "And I remember him," she replied. "We've come a long way together, haven't we, boy?" The first weeks of marriage were a period of adjustment for both of them. Fiona had to learn the rhythms of ranch life, while Quentin had to become accustomed to sharing his space and his decisions with a partner. There were occasional misunderstandings and moments of frustration, but they were far outweighed by the joy of building a life together. Fiona quickly won over the ranch staff with her kindness and willingness to learn. She surprised everyone, including herself, with how readily she adapted to her new surroundings. She learned to ride on a gentle mare Quentin selected for her, helped Mrs. Abernathy in the kitchen, and even assisted with the care of a newborn foal whose mother had died during birth. In the evenings, she and Quentin would sit on the porch watching the sunset or by the fire in their cozy parlor, planning for the future. They talked of expanding the ranch, of the children they hoped to have, of dreams both practical and fanciful. "I never imagined I could be this happy," Fiona confessed one night as they lay in bed, her head on Quentin's chest. "Nor I," he agreed, his fingers combing gently through her hair. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm dreaming, if I'll wake up and find myself back in that lined shack during the storm, alone." Fiona propped herself up to look at him. "This is real, Quentin. We're real." He pulled her down for a kiss that quickly deepened, and they lost themselves in each other, reaffirming the bond that had grown between them since that fateful day in Cripple Creek. As winter gave way to spring and spring to summer, their life together fell into a pleasant rhythm. Fiona established a small sewing room in the house where she created clothing for herself and Quentin, as well as taking commissions from families in the nearby town. Word of her skills spread, and soon she had a steady clientele, allowing her to contribute to the ranch's finances in her own way. Quentin's business thrived as well. His horses, known for their strength and intelligence, were in high demand throughout Colorado and beyond. He made several trips to Denver and other cities to negotiate sales, always returning with stories to share, and a renewed appreciation for their peaceful life together. In the autumn of 1888, a year after they first met, Fiona shared some news of her own. As they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the mountains in hues of gold and purple, she took Quentin's hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "We're going to have a baby," she said simply, watching his face for his reaction. For a moment, Quentin seemed stunned, then a smile of pure joy spread across his features. "A baby," he repeated, wonder in his voice. "When?" "Dr. Miller says sometime in the late spring," Fiona replied. "May, perhaps." Quentin gathered her into a gentle embrace. "A baby," he said again, as if he couldn't quite believe it. "Our baby." The months of Fiona's pregnancy passed in a whirlwind of preparation and anticipation. Quentin became even more protective, insisting on hiring additional help for the house so Fiona wouldn't overtax herself. He spent his evenings crafting a cradle from cherry wood, determined that their child would have the finest bed possible. The baby, a boy they named Samuel James Hayes, after Quentin's brother and Fiona's uncle arrived on a warm day in May 1889. He had his father's green eyes and his mother's copper hair, a combination that both parents agreed was perfect. "He's beautiful," Quentin whispered, holding his son for the first time, tears shining in his eyes. "Perfect." "Yes, he is," Fiona agreed, exhausted but radiant with happiness. As Samuel grew from infant to toddler, the ranch grew as well. Quentin purchased additional land, expanding their holdings and increasing their herd of horses. Fiona's sewing business continued to flourish, and she even took on an apprentice, a young woman from town who showed exceptional promise with a needle. Life wasn't without its challenges, of course. There were harsh winters when they worried about the horses surviving, dry summers when they feared for their water supply, and the normal trials of raising a spirited young boy. But through it all, the love between Quentin and Fiona only deepened, strengthened by the obstacles they overcame together. When Samuel was 3, they welcomed a daughter, Elizabeth Rose, named for Fiona's aunt and Quentin's mother. She was a quiet, thoughtful child from the beginning, with her father's dark hair and her mother's blue eyes. "Our family feels complete now," Fiona said as they stood together watching their children play in the yard, Samuel running circles around his younger sister who followed him with adoring eyes. "Almost," Quentin replied with a sly smile. "I was thinking perhaps one more." Fiona laughed, leaning into his embrace. "Let's see how we manage these two first." The years passed in a blur of ordinary days made extraordinary by the love they shared. Samuel grew into a strong, kind young man with his father's affinity for horses and his mother's quick wit. Elizabeth developed into a thoughtful, creative girl who showed a talent for both sewing and storytelling. In 1899, as the century drew to a close, Fiona and Quentin celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary with a party that brought together friends and neighbors from miles around. The ranch, now one of the most prosperous in the region, was decorated with lanterns and flowers, and tables groaned under the weight of food and drink. As the sun set and the guests danced to the music of a local string band, Quentin led Fiona away from the festivities to a quiet spot beneath the old oak tree where they often sat on summer evenings. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small velvet box from his pocket. Fiona opened it to find a gold locket, intricately engraved with their initials. Inside were tiny portraits of Samuel and Elizabeth, painted by a traveling artist who had passed through Boulder earlier that year. "It's beautiful," she breathed, turning it over in her hands. "Not as beautiful as you," Quentin said, his voice husky with emotion. 10 years ago, you couldn't afford a stagecoach ticket and I offered you my horse instead. It was the best decision I ever made." Fiona looked up at the man who had become the center of her world, his face now lined with a decade of laughter and worry, his hair beginning to show streaks of silver at the temples. He was more handsome to her now than he had been that day in Cripple Creek, because she knew the heart that beat beneath his chest, loyal, strong, and entirely hers. "I love you, Quentin Hayes," she said simply. "More today than yesterday, but not as much as tomorrow." He gathered her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that held all the passion of their youth and all the depth of their shared years. When they finally parted, he rested his forehead against hers, just as he had done on the night of their engagement. "When that stagecoach left without you," he whispered, "it was carrying away my loneliness, though I didn't know it at the time. You've given me everything, Fiona, a purpose, a family, a home filled with love. I couldn't ask for more." "Nor could I," she replied, her arms tightening around him. "From the moment you offered your hand to help me onto Rusty's back, I think a part of me knew we were meant to find each other." They stood together beneath the oak tree, the sounds of celebration drifting from the party, the laughter of their children mingling with the music. The sun had long since disappeared behind the mountains, but the moon cast a silver glow over the land they had nurtured together, a fitting metaphor, Fiona thought, for the light they had brought into each other's lives. "Shall we rejoin our guests?" Quentin asked after a while. Fiona nodded, slipping her hand into his as they had done countless times over the years. As they walked back toward the house, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment, a journey that began with a missed stagecoach and a cowboy's offer of his horse. Some might call it chance or coincidence, but Fiona knew better. It was destiny, written in the stars that had watched over them during their first night together in the wilderness. And as they rejoined the celebration of their life together, surrounded by friends and family, She silently thanked whatever fate had conspired to leave her standing in that dusty street in Cripple Creek, waiting for a cowboy with kind eyes and a generous heart to change her life forever.